Hello, and welcome to today's video on verbal delivery. Today, we are going to talk about the impacts of a speaker's language, something that I like to call the three purposes of rhetoric, signposting, verbal adjustments, and Rogerian arguments. So, the impacts of a speaker's language, and we're going to focus on a variety of different elements here. Now, first of all, there's research that's been done on what do audiences take away from a presenter's language. And, this isn't just studied in the context of public speaking. So, for example, in modern times, obviously, when you consume information content, you're not always just listening to a speech, right? Now, sometimes you're going to listen to a presentation for work related events, or maybe it's a TED talk you're interested in, or something like that. But we also just consume persuasive content or information in a lot of other ways. You could be watching a YouTube video, right? You could be listening to a podcast. And so this gets studied with audiences that consume content in all of these different ways, right? And when you ask audiences, what are you taking away, or what are the judgments you're making from a presenter's language? Here are usually the things that they will point out. So the first thing that they will tend to judge from language is the presenter's knowledge base of the material, right? So how knowledgeable are they on the subject? Secondly, audiences will look at confidence and they will make a general assessment on, do we think this person is confident in what they're saying, right? Do they feel assured in their positions? How honest are they? So we make evaluations on, do we think that they're being sincere with us? Do they think they're being transparent with us, right? So honesty is a lot of different things. It's like, do they believe what they're saying? Are they telling you everything? That's kind of where transparency comes into play. We also make evaluations on, do we think they're reliable? So this is essentially, are they credible, right? Are they trustworthy that they would be the one to know this topic very well and therefore be the ones we should be listening to regarding the topic? And then their comprehension. So this is very similar to knowledge, but it's essentially, what is their overall understanding, right, of the topic? Okay, so you can kind of think of knowledge as, I like to think of knowledge as essentially whatever it is that they talk about, do they seem to know that specific topic, right? Now, comprehension, I think, is even bigger than that. So it's not just like understanding that topic, but they kind of get the bigger picture, right? You get this sense that, they may cover A, B, and C, but they also know the other letters of the alphabet, so to speak, on that topic, right? So comprehension is like, do they have this broader, even deeper understanding? And so we make all of these judgments of the speaker based on their language. So this is one of the reasons that language is just really important, right? Because obviously, if audiences do not think you're honest and they don't think you're knowledgeable, right, then they're not likely to believe your message or be motivated by it, whether you're trying to change an attitude or behavior or just get them to care about a topic. So these are some of the reasons that your language, again, matters. Now, there's something else with language that I think you should kind of take away or understand that is important, which is, excuse me, is that oftentimes audiences will also judge your language based on this sense of, are you coming across as confident? And this deals with this notion of something called eh, using empowering language, so to speak, right? So language that makes you seem like you are confident in what you're saying, right? And that you're actually knowledgeable, that that based on your statements, it seems like, oh, gee, this person, this guy, this man or woman really does know what they're talking about, right? So empowering language is basically, the definition of this would be essentially be language that audiences read from, so it conveys that you're knowledgeable and confident on a topic. And powerless language is basically anything that doesn't do that, right? That makes you come across as not assured of yourself, right, or not assured of your position. And so when do we? It's kind of easier to see sometimes maybe what we judge as powerless, right? So what happens? And this isn't just from public speaking. So you'll notice in a lot of videos, I talk about things not just from a public speaking context, but also just from other communication dynamics and situations. So this applies to a lot of things, not just public speaking. Like people, you could be in a conference room at your job, and there's five people around the table, and people are giving their opinions or something, and people will take away this sense of, are you confident? Are you using powerful or powerless language, even in that setting, not just a speech? So it works in all these different contexts. But anyway, so powerless language would be things like hesitations, hedges, even politeness in some situations. So go back to that boardroom example. The boss is in the room, or the person who's leading the meeting, and they say, we have a choice. We're at a fork in the road, and we could do A or B. What do you think we should do? And Kevin says, I think we should do A. It's going to increase profits. Or Kevin says, I think we should do B because it's more like customer focused, like they're going to be happy. So, the money we make is about the same, but customers will feel better about it. So we should do A or we should do B, right? And Susan says, well, it's just my opinion, but I think we should do A. Now, that is a hedge or a hesitation when you say it's just my opinion, but. Or let's say Susan says, I'm not saying that Kevin's wrong or that Kevin doesn't have a valid point, but I think we should do C, right? Now that's kind of like being polite, right? Like I'm not saying you're an idiot, but I'm about to say let's do something else, right? And by the way, the reason that I use the names like Kevin versus Susan is research into gender and communication essentially is that men and women tend to have differences in how whether or not and how often they use these hedges or hesitations. So long story short, basically, if you take courses that will focus on some of the research in this, is that women tend to use a lot of hedges and hesitations. So when they are communicating, they are way more likely to just say, it's just my opinion, but or I'm not saying so and so is wrong, but I think we should do this. And it's basically has to deal with like how men and women are like kind of socialized slightly differently, and women tend to be socialized to really focus on maintain harmony in relationships and cohesions within a group. And so they're just more likely to be polite and not be as abrasive when they give an opinion because they want to maintain that like they're socialized to care about maintaining that harmony. Men tend to not be socialized quite that same way. In fact, men actually are tends to be socialized a little bit more with a competition focus. And so if you're socialized into like a competition focus, like just, look out for you, then you're less likely to do that, right? You're just gonna be like, here's my opinion, man, right? And so guys tend to use less of these hedges. Now, by the way, the reason I'm like sort of bringing up that example is this is actually one of the reasons you do have like research into the glass ceiling. If you've ever heard of the glass ceiling, the glass ceiling is this concept where you have men and women doing the same job, but yet women are paid less, right? And I'm not talking about fields where you can make an argument that there's a valid reason for that. Like let's take the NBA players versus WNBA players. There's a reason WNBA players make less money, and they should make less money. You want to know why? Because their business doesn't bring in as much money as the NBA. That's how any business works. You get paid based on what you bring in, what your worth is, like financially, right? NBA players are worth more. The NBA makes more money. That's how that. So that's not a discrimination thing. That's not an inequality thing. That's a business 101 thing, right? Now, what the glass ceiling is looking at is situations that does not apply, where the only explanations could be inequality things. So, for example, take the field of like lawyers or attorneys. If you have a man and a woman in a firm, they both have the same educational background and level of experience, but yet the man is making more. This happens a lot actually. That would be an example of the glass ceiling because there's no practical reason for that, right? Like there's no rational explanation because their financial worth to that firm or to the client is the same. So why is the female making less, right? So some arguments as to so why do you have the glass ceiling? How does this affect the glass ceiling? Is basically that women in the workplace tend to use these hedges or hesitations. They do not come across therefore as very confident or assertive. Like think about it. If you're listening to two people give their opinion, you're in that conference room, right? Who sounds more confident? Who sounds more like Captain CEO, right? The superhero leader. Like is the person who says, I think we should do A because it increases profits by 20%, or the person who says, it's just my opinion, but I think we should do A, right? Or I'm not saying Kevin's wrong, but I think we should do B, right? Obviously the first person, right? And so what happens is when you don't come across as super confident in yourself or like assertive and knowledgeable or as somebody who sort of like, just gives their opinion that way, then you just kind of don't come across as like a leader or for lack of a better phrase, management material. And what happens is you're just not viewed the same way. You're not viewed as somebody who knows their stuff as much, and you're less likely to get promoted, right? You're less likely to get that raise. It's a perception thing essentially. And so there's some arguments that is made that that's actually part of why we have the glass ceiling, is that women use these hedges or hesitations. They don't come across as like really assertive or confident, and therefore they're just not promoted and not given the raises, right? And there's actually research that happens in companies that are ran by women. So like it's like female on female crime. So it's not just like men doing this. But anyway, so you really want to avoid these, right? The takeaway from this, by the way, even if you don't give a lot of speeches, is don't use these when you give your opinion because you come across as not empowering, right? And again, as far as like go just to like quickly like summarize that point, like think about in your head, like if you were to imagine the ideal like leader of a company, again, captain, CEO, superhero, like who is that person, right? You picture somebody who's like confident and they take charge. In other words, you don't picture somebody who uses hedges and hesitations. So don't use them, right? You want to come across as that person that they would perceive, right? As this ideal leader or manager, if that's where you want to go. So, in other words, if you want to be the ideal leader or manager for somebody, if you want them to perceive you that and hire you for that job, then you need to walk the talk. You need to act like it. You got to fit the role, right? That's kind of what I'm saying. So, speaking of superheroes, there was a commercial that ran a couple years ago. This is a little side note here. Story time with Brian, Professor Brian. I thought it was really good. Like it showed these kids like playing, and they're playing like superhero or whatever, and they're all having fun. And I don't even remember what it was a commercial for. I want to think it was actually a credit card or something. But anyway, at the very end, the kid's like pretending he's flying or something, or he's there with his cape, and it just fades to black, and it says, when you were a kid, nobody wanted to be Money Man. Think about that for a minute. When you were a kid, nobody wanted to be Money Man. In other words, when you go back to the root of what made you happy, right? It wasn't about money and possessions. And I thought it was a good like reminder in life, right? That like sometimes we lose sight of what matters or what really gives us joy. But anyway, all right, that's the end of my side note. Side note. I thought it was a good commercial. All right. Anyway, other things about empowering language. Like I want to give you a couple of other examples. So the real way to think about like empowering versus disempowering, if you want to avoid using this, whether it's a speech or just an everyday kind of like vernacular in your life, so you don't get perceived as somebody who's not confident and assertive, is there's basically two ways to avoid it. The first thing is don't use hedges. Don't say it's just my. So you have this list here of disempowering phrases, and if you think about it, like so, this first one is just my opinion, but that's hedging, right? So don't use hedges. You don't always have to be polite. Just say your opinion. It's like when you take the writing courses and they say you don't write in your paper, I feel that blah 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 or I think blah blah blah. You just say what you think, right? You didn't source it, so it's clearly your opinion. Um, so the first thing is don't use hedges. The second real way to come across as more confident and empowering and knowledgeable is to be detailed. Be detailed. So if you think about this list here of what's disempowering versus empowering, the real difference besides a hedge is that what's considered empowering, what people take away from and they read as confident, is when you're detailed, right? When you actually explain what you're talking about. So, for example, somebody says, it's just my opinion, but versus saying, I believe I have a solution, an answer or a proposal would be, because it makes you like say what the solution is. It makes you, so go back to that example I said where the person said, not only did they not use a hedge, but they said, it's more customer focused. It's going to increase profits by 20%. They're being detailed, right? Instead of, so that's what that second example is, better versus a more customer focused, right? When you apologize, right? There's actually research into apologies. When you just say, I'm sorry, my bad, right? Not that anybody does that anymore because we have, as I've mentioned in multiple videos, we have a culture of no accountability where people just they do something bad and then you call them out on them and they're just like, you're a hater, I'm tuning out the noise. It's like ridiculous. It's like you created the noise, man, by doing the bad thing. But anyway, uh, so there's research into this that if you just say I'm sorry, right, or my bad, people don't buy it. They don't believe it. They don't think it's sincere. And what's going on there? You're not detailed. So research and apologies. Again, if you're detailed, people are more likely to believe it. So I had to be detailed in apologies in an apology, right? You say you're sorry. I apologize. I'm sorry. But you also have to say what you're apologizing for. So I'm sorry I did A, B, or C. And then what you're going to do to fix it. So, and this is what I'm going to do moving forward to make sure that this never happens again. Sorry, we got we got we got a TV problem here. Try to fix it. Sorry. Um, so you have to say what it's for. Now, again, people are more likely to think you're sincere because you're explaining yourself, right? So it's just about being detailed. You got to be detailed, right? Or we'll have to agree to disagree. Don't, again, that sounds, it's not a hedge, but it kind of sounds like a cop out, right? Where you're just like taking your ball and going home. That pisses people off. They don't like it. So you can't do that either, right? So don't do that. So it's a little bit okay to say I see it differently because then you have to explain what you see different, right? So what that's it's being detailed, right? If you say we'll have to agree disagree, if you just say whatever, right? That's just like it's just a vague, ambiguous response. It's kind of like a cop out. You're not explaining yourself at all. If you just say like, well, do you think A and this is still why I think B at the end of the day, you're gonna come like the people may disagree with you, but because you're being detailed, they're more likely to think you're sincere and at least have a little bit more respect for that and at least think you're knowledgeable in what you're saying. So be detailed, don't use the hedges, and people are going to think that you are much more confident or sincere in what you're saying. Certainly in the case of the apologies. By the way, this is another example of this, like dealing with resumes and like how employers will look at your resume or things you say in a job interview and perceive you as being more confident and assertive. So again, another way you can apply this outside of public speaking and just in your everyday life. So empowering language is this is what's considered empowering. So you say in your resume or the job interview, you use the words created, increased, reduced, improved, developed, accomplished. What do they say is disempowering? Using the words responsible, strategic, creative, effective, expert. Well, what the heck's the difference? Right? I know what you're thinking. You're going, Brian, you telling me creative's good, but creative's bad. What are you smoking over there? Right? Well, first of all, I don't smoke. I'm not a pot guy. I don't know a lot about pot. Like I could walk into the shop and I really know nothing. I'm not a pot guy. And they could sell me cilantro. They could just be like, it's iceberg lettuce and tell me it's $500. And I'd be like, okay, I don't know. I don't know. I'm not sure if I mentioned that in another video, but I don't know. I know what you kids are into. But I'm not having I'm not into the wacky tobacco. But anyway, so created is good, creative's bad. And you're like, what the heck's the difference? Well, what's the difference? Details, right? Think about it. All of the words that are listed as empowering end with ed, right? Created, increased, reduced. You cannot use those in a sentence without being detailed. So you can't say I'm created. You have to explain what you created. You can't say you improved something. You have to say what you improved, right? What did you accomplish? What did you develop? Now, you can just say I'm creative. Anybody can say that in a in a job interview, right? The person could say, "What do you think is one of your biggest strengths?" And you say, "Oh, I'm creative." Well, okay, anybody can say that. You've given no proof of concept, right? You've provided no proof you're creative. If you say created, you have to in that sentence be detailed, right? So while this may seem like these two words listed on both sides are exactly the same and like there's no difference, look at how they'd be used in a sentence. The difference is one requires you to be detailed and one doesn't, right? So be detailed. So don't use hedges, be detailed, and you'll be perceived as being powerful when you use your language. So just some big picture takeaways about how the language you use is sort of judged by your audience. Those things like confidence, honesty, transparency, knowledge about the topic, all those sorts of things, comprehension, but also are you confident and assertive? That goes to that empowering versus disempowering element. Now, there's also something I like to call the three purposes of rhetoric, and what I'm doing here is sort of breaking down three big picture things, three big ticket items that your language can potentially accomplish in a speech. So that I think are important to really focus and hone in on. So the first one is establishing credibility. Then you have providing value and inspiring action. So really, this is a checklist. This isn't necessarily in any kind of order, although it tends to actually go in this order where it's you use your language to establish credibility, you then provide the value, and then you then inspire the action. But you do want to look at your content of your message, whether it could be, again, any information content. This could be a speech, this could be a YouTube video, this could be your podcast. I don't know. Um, I don't know what you're going to do, right? Whatever your presentation for work, whatever it may be. You want to see it at least as a checklist of do I do all three? Now, again, it's usually in this order. So what is establishing credibility? Excuse me. So establishing credibility means credibility in either in you and credibility in the topic. So credibility in the topic is have you convinced the audience that this topic is important, something they should care about and listen to and invest their time and energy in, right? Credibility in you is basically, are you the one they should listen to, right? So I've used this example before in other videos where um, if you start to watch a YouTube video on something, and if you're watching the video on it, especially if it's a topic you tend to have, you're not just like randomly watching something. It's something you're generally kind of interested in. You watch videos on this all the time. It already has topic credibility. You already think the topic's worth your time. But let's say you start to watch the video and you don't like it because you don't like that creator, right? Like you think that they're not very credible, or they're just doing a crappy job in the video, and so you don't want finish it, and you certainly don't subscribe to the channel and all that sort of stuff. You don't hit that like button. Um, so what's going on there? They don't have speaker credibility, right? So it still has topic credibility. Like you might still go watch another video on the topic from somebody else, right? But they don't have speaker credibility. So you have these like two levels. So usually early on in a speech, you establish the sort of motivational link, or in any kind of persuasive message. Again, it doesn't have to be a speech. You establish the credibility in the topic through the motivational link. Why should you care right now? And then you also establish, usually in your intro early on, the credibility in you. Why should you listen to me? Providing value is just giving them information that's useful to them, whether if it's informative information, like I've mentioned before, that means information that is either educational to them, it's new, it's information in a different context, or it's clarifying misunderstandings, right? It's shedding light on something, or it's giving them literal value in terms of maybe persuading them to have a belief or a behavior that's going to improve their lives. Whatever it is, it's your content, whatever its value is, right? That's pretty self-explanatory. Inspiring action just means, what are you trying to get them to do? So if you're being formative, it might be to get them to care about the topic and learn more about it. If you're being persuasive, it might be to change an attitude or behavior. But it's what is the action step. So remember, you kind of want your language to accomplish all three. In terms of establishing credibility, the key points here is to make sure you do this early on. So just in case it's not there, there's obviously for some audiences where the credibility is already going to be there. It's more built in, or maybe your credibility is pretty obvious. You have the expertise, the credentials, and other times you got to work harder to do that, but you want to establish credibility in the topic and you early on. You want to be courteous. So you catch more flies with honey, right? As they say. So the reality just is, and we'll talk a little bit about this later. I talk about this in some videos on persuasion, that when you are nice to people, they tend to be more willing to listen to you, right? When you're not a jerk. So being courteous, being respectful of people, and not just, and this isn't just about being nice to them, it's also just maybe being respectful of their differing positions, right, than you, and things like that. Identifying common ground. So again, if you can meet them a little bit where they are, at least see where they're coming from, that can go a long way to establishing some credibility, because again, people literally think to themselves, well, at least you can get where I'm coming from, right? And always, I mentioned this in an earlier video, be informative before you're persuasive. So there's a phrase with it, as I mentioned before, ultimately, a lot of messages in real world settings are persuasive at the end of the day. In fact, I think you can make an argument that whether it's a speech or otherwise, that a lot of content ultimately is persuasive. Because you're always kind of selling something, a product in the real world, like a product, a service, or just you, right? That they should buy into you or something like that. And even in our personal lives, a lot of stuff's persuasive, right? Your parents ask a student, how's your classes going? are you not going to spin it a certain way, right? You're going to answer that question in whatever way possible that makes you look the best, right? So there's some persuasion going on there, right? Or when you're talking to your boyfriend or girlfriend about something, you're obviously, I mean, are you being honest? Yes, but are you also going to, of course, try to slightly slant everything into a direction that makes you look good? Of course you are. This is a natural human tendency, right? Now that being said, there's a phrase with like persuasion in psychology, which is that people love to buy, they hate to be sold. And what that means is we're willing to be persuaded, but we don't want to feel like we're being taken advantage of. And so, in other words, we want to feel like we're making logical, rational decisions. And people only feel that way when they have a logical, rational basis before they make the damn decision. So, what does that mean? You got to be informative first. So, in most scenarios, it does not work to just walk in the room and be like, and be hard sell persuasion, right? Be like, look at all the amazing things you're going to get with no real explanation as to how this is logical or rational. That usually does not work. And I've talked about some of the reasons in other videos, but for the most part, that turns people away because you're not giving them any informative, logical, rational foundation for the decision. They feel like it makes them uneasy because people want to feel like they're making logical, rational choices, right? They're okay to be persuaded as long as they feel like they had valid reasons to do what they did, essentially. So always be informative before you're persuasive. Providing value. So how do you make sure the content's useful to people? A couple of things. Uh, some of you think I need to work on this. That's a joke. Some of you like it's not a joke, right? Education and comedy. Tell your friends. Um, all right, providing value. When being informative, discuss things. So brainstorm ahead of time. What's new? What's not well-known information? What's misunderstood? Can you clarify understanding of something, right? Can you, or just like bring understanding to something to people who don't understand it, right? But actually giving them something that's useful. Don't just tell them something they already know. Focus on your audience. So focus on what they would want to hear, what they need to hear. Um, and less on you. This is something that gets talked about sometimes when people talk about how to prepare for a speech and public speaking anxiety. Is that one of the problems is oftentimes the speaker is just caught up in their head and they're focusing so much on themselves and how uh, how they're feeling, the anxiety they're feeling, instead of just focusing on having the right message, right? If you have the right message and deliver it the right way, everything else will kind of take care of itself. So, and the way you do that is you focus on your audience, right? So focus on your audience and what they would want to hear, what's going to be useful information to them. Use legitimate arguments and set reasonable expectations. Describe the ceiling and the floor of results. What this basically just means is don't use a lot of fallacies. Use honest, valid arguments and points and evidence and information. And again, when it comes to setting reasonable expectations, what that basically means is, first of all, don't lie to them, right? Don't promise them the moon and the stars and you can't deliver it, right? So don't do that. But also, look, if you consider like the possible result, let's say you're being persuasive and you consider like the possible result of a situation, 10 is the best case scenario, 1 is slight improvement but not much, and 0 is no change, right? A lot of the mistakes that people make who are not really trained in this is they come in the room and they always talk about 10, 10, 10, 10, 10. So if you do what I want, you can get a 10. And wouldn't a 10 be awesome? And look at this 10. They got a 10. Isn't that great? Their life is amazing, right? People are like, oh, great, I want a 10. So let's say you give that speech to 40 people. 15 do what you want. 20 do what you want, let's say. And out of that 20, it's a month later. And out of the 20 that did what you want, there's 5 that got a 10, and there's some that got a 7, and some got a 4, and some got a 3. Well, that's actually not good for you. What's the problem? Well, by focusing only on the best case scenario, you've set up a scenario where most people are actually going to be disappointed. Now, why is that? Because you promised them the moon and the stars. You only talked about the best case scenario, the 10. And so everybody got 10. The 5 out of 20 that got a 10, they're going to be happy. But all the people that didn't get a 10, they're going to be a little disappointed. Like the people that got a 5, they're like, hey, man, this 5's nice, but it ain't a 10, right? Glad I got a 3, but it ain't a 10. Glad I got a 7, but it's not a 10. Sure wish it was a 10, right? And so you just don't want to do that. It doesn't mean you don't talk about the 10, right? But it's just that when you persuade people, you want to describe the ceiling and the floor. So in other words, describe all possible outcomes. So now you come in the room, instead of saying you could just get a 10, you say, you could get a 10. I hope you do. That would be amazing. That is my wish for you. Right? But you could also get a 7 and you could also get a 3. And you know what? If you get a 3, that still is better than where you're at now. Right? Now you've set it up for everybody does what you want for them all to be happy. Not just for them all to be happy, not disappointed. Now, why? Because in the second scenario where you described all of the possible outcomes, what you basically did is you came in the room and said, if you do what I want, you will get a benefit, which means you have something to gain and nothing to lose because you are guaranteed to be better off tomorrow than you are today. Right? Why say no when every reason is telling you to say yes? Right? Because you'll be better off tomorrow than you are today. Because if you get a 2, that's still better than the 0 where you're at now, right? Or a 4 or a 7 or hopefully a 10, right? And so describe all the possible outcomes. It's a very common sort of untrained mistake is to only focus on the best case scenario. Inspiring action. So getting people to change a belief or a behavior or just think a topic is important. You have to have a good motivational link. I've talked about this before, but a motivational link, a good one, is why your audience should care about the topic right now. It is not just why your audience should care. That's not good enough because no bank cashes, as I've said before, no bank cashes the check of potential. People do not, just because somebody know they should do something or it's the right thing to do, people don't do it. People don't do things that they know are the right thing to do constantly, right? People, for a variety of reasons. They procrastinate, they say someday, they're like, I got plenty of time, I got plenty of runway to get to it, and they just never do it, right? So to actually inspire action, you have to create urgency. So because I got news for you, the road of someday leads to town and nowhere. Like people just don't do it. So you have to create a motivation link where people want to take action right now. So it's why care right now. And then the second thing too that's important as far as like getting over that hump to actually inspire action is make sure that you emphasize that your audience is actually capable of whatever it is you're trying to persuade them to do if you're being persuasive, right? Or sometimes even if it's understanding a topic like making sure that they believe that like they're capable of like understanding this, right? Like there's some topics like that where people avoid it because they think it's too complicated, right? And oftentimes it's not. It's just a matter of getting them over that hump, right? Of believing that it's too complicated, right? But whether it's them thinking it's too complicated or thinking it's something that like other people could do but not them, you have to get over that, right? Like you've probably heard of imposter syndrome, right? Imposter syndrome is this psychological concept where people will sometimes get into situations. It's mostly discussed in job settings, but you could apply it to other situations. But sorry, allergies. People get in these situations and they think, like, go back to the job scenario, and they think, well, I'm not really competent at this, and I just hope that I can figure it out before they fire me, right? It's like I'm just gonna fake it till I make it kind of thing, right? But I'm not really good enough. And it's this like self-defeating like part of our psychology. It's usually total BS and it's not real, but it's something that's like there for us. Well, it turns out that that type of defeatist kind of the like mindset, it tends to bleed into our psychology when it comes to persuasion, where people come in the room and they try to get you to adopt a belief or a behavior. And a lot of people look at it and go, well, yeah, probably that could work and that would be beneficial for my life. And I see that it's worked for other people. I don't think you're lying, but it works for them, but not for me, right? I couldn't do it. They can do it. I can't do it. Okay. And so you got to overcome that. Now, again, this is also much like imposter syndrome in the workplace, usually BS. Like people are capable of doing a lot more than they give themselves credit for. I mean, I've just seen it. I've seen it in life, man. You'd be surprised. It's amazing what if people are really committed to something, what they can do. And but you got to help them overcome that a little bit. So make sure you emphasize they're actually capable of it. Now, what is signposting? If you have taken whether you did like if you've done speech and debate at all in high school or college or you've taken other public speaking courses, Toastmasters, I don't know, some other public speaking training, you would have heard of this notion of signposting, which is essentially this term for using your delivery to emphasize your organization. Now, there's a lot of ways to signpost in a presentation. So it's now we're just focusing on verbal, although I'll mention a few nonverbals real briefly. But in terms of verbally, how do you emphasize your organization? Now, if you go back to organization again, the reason this matters is because if you are organized, if you're, it helps your audience understand what the key points are and what the big takeaways are, and not only that, but it helps build speaker and topic credibility. Because if audiences perceive you as organized, they then tend to perceive that whatever it is, the content you're saying must be legitimate and true as well. So that's why it's important to like actually use the signpost, give signals to the audience that you are organized, because it helps them digest the content and it helps their perception of you, right? So first of all, make statements that are signposts. So this is like having a clear thesis statement, one sentence that previews your topic and your main points, having transition statements, having a review statement that starts your conclusion. So today we talked about topic one, and more specifically, we talked about A, B, and C, right? So having these actual statements, you can ask the audience a question and use signposts that way. So, for example, if I just talked about how something will save you time, and my next main point is how it'll save you money. If I said how many people would benefit from an extra $500 at the end of the year, just by a show of hands. So I'm asking the audience a question, and obviously most people are going to raise their hand and say I could. And then I say, well, great, let's talk about how this will save the typical person $50 a month, which is $500 a year. So I use the answer to the question as a way to transition into, right, the next point of my speech. Another way to do a signpost, like emphasize to your audience what is important, is to use something called the three S's. So what the three S's are is a situation where you state your conclusion, right? So A is true, or you should adopt argument one, right? And then you explain the reason why A is true or argument one is true. And then so therefore one, therefore A, is you restate the conclusion. So it's called the three S's, where you basically state the conclusion, you support it, and you restate it. And what this is it's having you sort of consistently restate your position to emphasize it to people, right? To make them think, oh, position really matters because they're really emphasizing this, right? So that is the three S's. And then emphasize key points. So this is really like the three S's, right? Where if something is just really important, just keep, make sure you bring it up more than once, right? So it's kind of like the motivational link. Like I talk a lot about how you want to introduce that in your introduction, but you also kind of want to come back to that throughout the speech. Whatever that main point is, you don't want to just lose it, right? Just because you're going through the body of the speech. So whatever is like really important, those key points, like come back to them, right? Or those themes, or I mean, this really depends on the topic, right? But just make sure you emphasize them. So those are some ways to use signpost from a verbal perspective. Now, obviously, from nonverbal perspectives, other ways you could do this would be, we'll talk more about this in my video on nonverbals, but physically moving across the room, right, during transitions between main points, because that creates what's called an orienting response. So in other words, audiences tend to pay attention to something unusual in their environment. So if you're going to take several steps, you're going to change positions, that's unusual in their environment, they're more likely to actually pay attention to what's going on. So things like that are referring to your visual aids as you transition between main points. That's a nonverbal way to do this, right? And you can combine these. Obviously, when you're using signposts, the best way to do this is you're doing all of them, right? You're using verbal, you're using nonverbal, you're just kind of mixing, right? Mixing it up there. So make sure you use them. Verbal adjustments. Now, this is more of a real world thing that I kind of wanted you to just be aware of, and that's this, which is, when you take a public speaking class in college or high school or something, and you take one of these classes, you give a speech, and a lot of times what happens is you give a speech on a topic, and the audience doesn't really necessarily ask questions because they're just there listening to the topic, right? They didn't have a pre-built-in reason to be invested here, so they're not going to ask questions. Now, in the real world, they're probably going to ask the questions, right? Because they're invested. And so why are they invested? Because they're probably listening to the speech for something that has to do with their job, which is like their money, and the people, or they're investing in something, just their own money. It's not their job. Well, people like their money and they want to hold on to it. And so they're invested, right? They're going to ask questions. And so they're going to challenge you on some stuff. They might already know something about the topic too, right? Which is part of why they're asking these questions, right? And so you have to like anticipate. What I'm saying is you're going to get interrupted. They're going to ask you questions. You should try. So what should you do? Anticipate those ahead of time. Okay. So anticipate in the ahead of time, like, hey, what would those questions be? This is like in a job review, right? Where people say, think about what the questions they're going to ask you ahead of time so you can try to like respond to that, right? So it's the same situation here with your speech audience. Anticipate the questions ahead of time, um, and basically try so you can try to come up with answers, right? Now, when you do answer questions, you have a couple options. You can answer the question if you have a valid answer it. If you don't have an answer, say you'll look into it, right? You could always do that, and it's okay to. I'm gonna talk about in a second, like why it's okay to do that. But like, hey, say, hey, I got to look into this, or tell them where they can find the answer. And if you do answer it, by the way, confirm you actually answered it. But this is actually an important thing to keep in mind. Um, you got to get comfortable. It's okay to say I don't know, right? Like a lot of people naturally, intuitively, we don't want to do that because people don't like to admit that they just don't know, or maybe they're wrong, right? Or I shouldn't say maybe they're wrong. They just don't want to admit they don't know, right? Because it's kind of like it's a little bit like an ego thing. We're just defensive. We don't want to just say, "Well, I don't know the answer to that," right? But in real settings, especially like job settings or situations where you'd be giving a presentation or a speech, you better start to get comfortable with that because in a real setting, if you just BS an answer because you don't want to admit you don't know, right? What happens? They go out, they rely on that answer you gave, and problems happen. Now, when problems happen in a real setting because you gave a crap BS answer, you know what happens? They want their money back, right? They're complaining about you. They're trashing you online, right? They're going to go scorched earth. That's a problem for you. They're going to complain, right? And so you don't want to do that, right? And look, there's some jobs or fields where they're paying you for your advice. Like that's literally what they're paying you for. So you can't just give them BS advice, right? So it's okay to say, I don't know. I have to look into it. Now, you can come up with like creative ways to say that, right? Like you don't have to say it. You can, in other words, in communication courses, sometimes talk about saying things in a face saving or identity saving manner, right? So what does that mean? Identity saving or face saving manner means saying something in a way that doesn't make you look bad, right? Like it's like common sense. You know this. We've done this in life, right? Where you say something in a way that makes you look as best as possible, right? So you can come up, depending on your job or your situation, with a creative way to say, I don't know, I got to look into it, besides saying, no, 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 right? But be comfortable doing that. Be comfortable admitting, I just got to look into it, right? Because it'll save yourself the problem of you have a bigger problem if you just blurt out the wrong answer, right? And again, like I said, confirm you've actually answered it. Now, this last thing I kind of wanted to cover is this research on Rogerian arguments. And it's kind of like a language thing slash a persuasion thing. But what this is basically kind of focusing on is research into does it matter like sort of your sort of tact with people when you're trying to convince them that what they're to basically change directions or course, or for lack of a better phrase, that what they're doing is wrong. So in other words, they're doing A and you're trying to tell them to do B. And what Rogerian arguments are looking at is does it matter if I just sort of walk in the room and I just sort of tell it like it is, so to speak? I'm like, you need to hear this, and I'm sorry if this upsets you, but it's the truth, right? If you got an issue, I got a tissue, right? Tough love. Versus excuse me, you try to massage it a little bit. So in other words, you try to do it in a way that doesn't offend people. It's not abrasive. I'm still going to explain why you need to change things and what you're doing is wrong, but you're going to do this in a slightly different approach, right? Like a little more like friendly approach and non-abrasive. So does it matter? So the research says it does matter, right? And it's actually counter to what you tend to see in the popular culture. Now I have like images up here of a couple of shows, like because when I say popular culture, is what I mean is these shows that deal with like business or leadership or successful people. I should actually use air quotes because some of these people are not as successful as we tend to think they are. They just have money, like they come from money, right? They didn't make the money themselves, but because they have the money, we just assume they're successful, right? But anyway, um, what we see on these shows with like these people that are really successful or whatever, or some of them are legitimately successes in their fields, is they're very abrasive, right? Like so, if you've ever seen, so here I've got Shark Tank, I've Bar Rescue. You know, I certainly could have put up like stuff with like Hell's Kitchen or like Gordon Ramsay or things like that. And so like when you watch these shows, right? For example, um, like Gordon Ramsay on Hell's Kitchen or these shows, he's this like, you know, world renowned chef. He's dealing with these other chefs in these cooking competitions, and when they screw up, he's yelling at them. He's calling them all kinds of names, and he's very abrasive, right? Or Bar Rescue. Bar Rescue is this series run. It basically features this guy named John Taffer, and he's run a lot of successful bars and restaurants and he goes into these failing bars and restaurants and he tells them how to fix it. Now, before he fixes it, he's yelling at them and telling them essentially how stupid they are and all the mistakes they're making, right? Or sometimes on Shark Tank, which is probably the one I guess you guys are probably the most familiar with, is these people come on with inventions or ideas for a business or a project, and the sharks have the money and they pitch them on like funding it. But sometimes they get a little snippy with the investor, with the people who created the project, right? They're like the shark will be like, "Well, I'll fund it, but you got to give me 95% of the profits," right? And the person who created the business, they kind of scoff at that, like, "I don't want to do that," right? And then the sharks are like, "Well, how dare you? Like, how stupid? Why? What do you mean you won't give me 95% of the profits for that? Right? You fool." Um, and they can be a little abrasive, right? So my point is, you see this in popular culture where people act like this, and so then people think they tend to internalize that, like, well, because I've seen this, this is how successful people are. And that just is not. First of all, it's not what the research says that works in any manner. It doesn't. And second of all, it doesn't. Second of all, it doesn't work with common sense. And third of all, it doesn't work because while these are real people, and many of them legitimately are really successful, what you're seeing is not the approach they use to get successful. Okay, so let's dispel why this stuff doesn't work. First of all, I mentioned like it doesn't work from a common sense perspective. So that's the easiest one. So let's dispose of that first. Think about it. How many times have you seen somebody where the boss like calls them like tells the employee or somebody in a position of power tells the other person, "Hey, I looked at your project, right? It's pretty good, but you left a few things out." And they're like, "What'd you leave out?" And like, "Well, it's you're an idiot, you moron. Do better." Now, in that situation, when somebody calls somebody an idiot and says they're a moron, do better, try harder, be better tomorrow, right? How many times does the person want to go, or if you've ever been in that position, do you see them or do you want to go like, you know what? You're right. I am an idiot. I will do better tomorrow. Thank you for calling me an idiot. Like common sense says no. People get defensive, right? It divulges into insults upon people's mothers, right? Like nobody in real settings like positively reacts to being called all of these things and being talked to this way. So common sense says it doesn't work. Okay, first of all. Second of all, why is this not like, well, the research says it doesn't work, that people don't like this, right? Now, the third part, which you might be like, what do you mean? Because I'm seeing it in these shows, where I say that's acting this way is not what made these people successful. Now, you could say, like, well, what do you mean when this is what I'm seeing on these shows? Well, here's why. Um, so these shows these are real people, real contestants. It's the real world, but it's not realistic. Okay. And what I mean is, uh, these are scenarios where the power dynamic is not what it's like in the real world, including the real world for how all of these people run their businesses. Okay. What you're watching on television is like the 2%, 5% isolator situations. And there's situations that allow them to act that way and get away with it that they're not normally in, including people like Mark Cuban, including people like Gordon Ramsay. Okay. So, how can I say that? Well, what's weird about the power dynamic? Well, the power dynamic is weird in this way. Here's what's going on. Um, in all of these types of real world shows you're watching on business, right? The host can be a jerk because they're the ones with all the power. Think about it. If a chef's career does not take off, if he just doesn't succeed, do you think that that affects Gordon Ramsay? Right? He's still going to run his Michelin star restaurants and be super awesome. Like his life and his career is going to be just fine, thank you very much. Right? Like whether or not these chefs succeed or not, he has nothing to lose by acting this way, except for to get better ratings for his show because conflict gets ratings. Same thing with John Taffer. If these bars fail or succeed, do you really think that that affects John Taffer? Right? Um, I got news for you. It doesn't. Because he still runs a lot of successful bars and restaurants. He doesn't need these bars to succeed. And by the way, a lot of them do fail. Have you ever watched Bar Rescue? At the end of the show, they always fade to black and they're like sales improved by 20%. But if you actually Google these bars and these restaurants, most of them still fail, right? Because he didn't have enough time to fix a lot of the problem, all of the problems, right? Like for long-term sustainability. He's still going to be fine. And again, he's still got the ratings. And by the way, of course, the producers encourage the conflict, right? If these, because that gets ratings, right? So, and the people on the show, they take this abuse because they don't have a choice, right? They need John Taffer's help. Their bar or restaurant is failing, right? They feel like they have nowhere else to turn, or they feel like this is such an opportunity to work with Gordon Ramsay. I have to just accept him being a total jerk to me, right? A terrible person to me, uh, because of the because of the doors that Gordon Ramsay could potentially open, right? So, in other words, they're in a position of power, so they can get away with being a jerk. Like, use your common sense, right? What do we know about people, unfortunately? A lot of times when they're in a position of power and they can be a jerk, they kind of are. Not everybody, but I guess we see that happen, right? I shouldn't necessarily say a lot of the time, but we do see it happen, obviously, right? And that's kind of what you're seeing here, and it's encouraged because of it gets ratings on television. It's the same thing like on Shark Tank. Like if these inventions don't work, do you think that that affects Mark Cuban? Like Mark Cuban was a billionaire he's a billionaire several times over just from his sale of the Dallas Mavericks alone. He used to own the Dallas Mavericks, the NBA team, right? Um, so this doesn't matter. Like these things he funds on Shark Tank, this is less than like change in his car console to him, right? Like he'll be fine either way. So they can get away with this. So I guess my point about this, I didn't mean to go on too long of a rant, is just we see all this stuff happening by all these successful people in business, and some of them are really successful. Now some of them are a little fake. Like if you guys would just do your homework on some of their background, they just had money, man. It doesn't mean they ever did anything to make the money. They came from the money. In other words, their parents made the money. But it's like you see people acting this way, and then people think, well, that's how you be a successful business person. It's like, well, is it, or is that how you run a TV show to get that gets ratings, right? And remember, I said they don't really do this to be successful in their real life. Like, think about it. When Gordon Ramsay goes to another restaurant, or he's dealing with another chef who runs a Michelin star restaurant, do you think he can act that way? No, because that chef can be like, I don't need you. I'm a Hall of Famer myself, right? Like, or when John Taffer walks into another really well run bar or restaurant, they don't need him, right? There's also other people that run successful bars and restaurants, so you can't act that way, right? So what I should have said about that was they can't act this way in 95% of the situations, so you won't be able to either. So keep that in mind. It's a real situation, not realistic. So what tends to work in most realistic situations, 95% of the time, and also in common sense and what the research says, is that if you're gonna come in the room and you're gonna tell people that what they're doing is wrong, right? They're doing A and they should do B. What you should do is, instead of calling them a moron, right, is acknowledge any common ground and the merits of the other side. So, in other words, I'll start out right away by saying, hey, here's what we have in common. I see where you're coming from, all that kind of stuff, right? Do that first, okay? What does this do for you? It establishes credibility to where people then start to look at you and go, okay, you see where I'm coming from. You can at least see my perspective. And so therefore they think you're more credible and that your position, whatever it is you're going to now tell them to do, is maybe more credible, even though it's telling them to do something that's different from what they're currently doing. This also, by the way, allows you to identify anything that can be resolved quickly. So it's like if they're on one hand they're doing A and you're trying to tell them to do B, sometimes there are things you have in common that they can still keep doing, right? That, like, in other words, we need to come to 10 points of agreement. It's not that we disagree on all 10, right? So this is really a matter of us just figuring out a couple of things here, right? So you have that. And so that's another reason to do this, right? So you start out by acknowledging common ground and the perspective of where they're coming from. And then what you do is you discuss the ways in which your goals can satisfy the other side's interests as well. So seek a win-win. So in other words, uh, if you're two people in a negotiation, it's the way that, like, if I get what I want, you'll still get what you want, like explaining that to them. Or in a scenario where I've been more kind of discussing here, which is they're doing A and you're trying to get them to do B. What this means is you explain to them how B will still accomplish exactly what they want. So here's an example. So take these like failing bars, like in bar rescue, like failing bars and restaurants. One of the most common reasons that they fail, there's a lot of reasons, but is people start to just hire their buddies, right? So, for example, they open a bar and they hire all their friends because, hey, a couple of reasons. They get to give their friend a job. That's cool. And they like their friends. They're their friends for a reason and they want to hang out with their friends. Even more awesomeness, right? But the problem is you've hired your friends. And if they're bad employees, like especially in a bar or restaurant, which I mean, I don't run a bar or restaurant, but my understanding, maybe some of you out there do, um, I guess they have really low profit margins. Like it's a real fine line, right? So they got to really run. You have to run a bar. I guess you got to run a bar or restaurant really efficiently, or it's not gonna work, right? Like so the profit margins are really slim. So one of the problems when you hire all your friends, this is a common thing people do, is that when it's not working out, it's hard to fire them because they're your friends. It's kind of hard to fire your buddies, right? So that's the scenario we got going on here. It's hard to fire your friends. So then people are in a bad situation. So let's say that's going on here. So what they did was A, they hired their friends. So how would I use a Rogerian argument in this scenario? It'd be like if I was John Taffer or if I was the consultant as I came in the room and I said, okay, look, so acknowledging common ground merits of their position, right? Look, I understand why you hired your friends. Like this is something anybody would do, right? You get to work with people that you like, right? You also get to help them out by giving them a job. Because of your friends, you might actually trust them more as employees, right? So there's lots of reasons why you would do this, right? So I get where you're coming from. I get why you did it. Now the problem, of course, is look, there's some things about it that are not working out. It's hard to discipline them. They're your friends. It's hard to or fire them, unfortunately, if need be. And so, how about this? What if, like, let's say you're the owner, right, of this establishment? What if you hire a middle manager? So this is somebody who, from this point forward, so your friends are still going to work here, right? But from this point forward, they do the hiring and the firing. They're the direct supervisor. Like you still own the place, but it's, you got to tell your friends, like, look, at the end of the day, it's in their hands. I'm empowering them to make these decisions because I don't want to be in a position where I have to fire you or be like discipline you or anybody here that I work with because you're my friend. And in fact, you can approach them and be like, if anything, this is good for the friendship, right? I don't want to jeopardize the friendship. I don't want to be put us in a position where our friendship's going to be harmed because I'm your direct boss. So this is actually better for you too. It's better for our friendship, right? And so now you can keep working. So you were doing A, which is hiring your friends, or you still get to hire your friends, but what you're doing now is B, because now you still get to work with your friends, but you have resolved the problem of it being difficult to deal with them when they're not working out as employees, or to discipline them or fire them, because you've hired a middle manager and you're going to let them make those decisions moving forward. And you're going to talk to the friend about it so they know ahead of time. And that's how we're going to go starting from this point forward, right? So now it's a win-win, right? You still satisfy your interests. You still get to work with your friends moving forward, but now we've removed the conflict, right? So you're doing B, you're doing something different, but you still got the result you wanted for now, right? And we'll see how it works, right? So it's based, that would be a Rogerian approach, and the approach where you just sort of tell it like it is because they need tough love would be you just walk in the room and say, "Hey, moron, stop hiring your buddy, stop hiring your cousin Jimmy," right? So because again, people don't respond well when you just call them a moron, right? Shocker. So it's not a good thing. So I hope that helped. I hope this helps. Kind of like we talked about a lot of things today with language and communication. So I hope you found it useful. As you again, a lot of this stuff doesn't just apply to public speaking, but it applies to a lot of other settings. So thank you for joining me, and hopefully I see you guys in the next video.